Hello everybody, this is Mr. Laubach. In this video, we are going to go over the New South, which coincides with the Gilded Age. So think post-Civil War South and the later decades of the 1800s. In this video, we will go over Henry Grady's vision of the New South, the Industrial South, Southern agriculture, sharecropping and the cycle of poverty, and the post-Reconstruction restoration of white supremacy redeemer governments in the South. I will conclude by talking about the separate but equal doctrine. So here we go. Henry Grady's vision. Henry Grady was the editor of the Atlanta Constitution who called for a New South that would be home to thriving cities, bustling factories, and rewarding business opportunities. Grady inspired a new generation of Southern leaders who strove to fulfill his vision of building a more diversified Southern economy after the Civil War. The industrialization of the South. Investors recognized that the South's ready supply of cheap labor, low taxes, and proximity to vast cotton fields created an ideal environment for building a profitable textile industry. Cotton mills soon flourished in small towns across the Piedmont region of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. By 1900, the South had about 400 cotton mills employing around 100,000 workers. By this time, the South had surpassed New England in the textile industry. James Buchanan Duke launched one of the South's greatest industrial successes when he founded the American Tobacco Company. By 1900, Duke's company produced 80% of the cigarettes manufactured in the United States. And at this point in history, America was full of smokers. And yes, Duke University was named after James Buchanan Duke. It was founded by his son, Washington Duke, who named it after his father. During the 1870s and 1880s, Birmingham, Alabama quickly became a major industrial center and manufacturing hub. The city's thriving iron and steel mills led supporters to proclaim their city was the, quote, Pittsburgh of the South. Memphis, Tennessee prospered as the center of the lumber industry in the South. However, there were limits to the development of industry in the South. Despite pockets of industrial development, Grady's dream of a diversified Southern economy remained elusive. In 1900, 2/3 of all Southern men still earned their living in farming. At that time, the average income in the South was only about 40% of their counterparts in the North. So Southern agriculture in the latter half of the 1800s. The dependence upon cotton. Cotton continued to be the South's most important cash crop. Between 1870 and 1900, the number of acres devoted to cotton production doubled as production soared to almost 10 million bales a year. The Southern economy became increasingly vulnerable to fluctuations in the global price of cotton. During the 1890s, a global surplus of cotton caused a 50% drop in prices that shook the Southern economy as debts and unemployment rose in the cotton industry. Now, a big part of the Southern agriculture economy was sharecropping. Cotton planters continued to own most of the land, while landless blacks and poor whites were forced to sell their labor. During the 1860s, cotton planters and blacks formed a new labor system called sharecropping. Under this arrangement, blacks and poor whites exchanged their labor for the use of land, tools, and seed. And they typically had to give the landowner half of their crop as payment simply for using the property. In addition to beginning with a debt to the landowner, sharecroppers had to borrow food, clothing, and other supplies from local storekeepers. These merchants then would take a lien or a mortgage out on the crops. Now, sharecropping led to a cycle of debt and poverty and was not very prosperous for the sharecroppers. Sharecropping definitely did not lead to economic independence. Facing interest rates as high as 50%, sharecroppers became entrapped in a seemingly endless cycle of debt and poverty. Sharecropping offered little hope for black or white tenants. During the 1890s, the problem of perpetual debt produced a harvest of discontent that led to the formation of farmers' alliances, or think of labor unions for farmers, and the beginning of the black migration out of the South to the North and out West. The end of Reconstruction in 1877 led to the restoration of white supremacy governments in the South. Political control in the South was left in the hands of a group of white Democratic Party leaders, collectively known as Redeemers, because they redeemed or saved the region from Republican rule. The Redeemers included merchants, financiers, and politicians who promoted economic growth based on industrialization and railroad expansion. At the same time, they also supported policies intended to restore a social system or hierarchy based on white supremacy. One of the byproducts of this was it led to the disenfranchisement of many black voters, meaning they lost their right to vote or were too intimidated to vote. The 15th Amendment prohibited states from denying anyone the right to vote because of race. Redeemer governments used literacy tests and poll taxes and grandfather clauses to evade the 15th Amendment. For example, poll taxes range from $1 in Georgia to $3 in Florida. Voters who skipped an election found that the tax accumulated from one election to the next. These Redeemer tactics worked. They also enlisted the help of the brutal KKK. During the 1890s, the number of black voters in the South plummeted. For example, in 1896, 130,000 blacks were registered to vote in Louisiana. Just 4 years later, the number plummeted to just over 5,000. By the early 1900s, African Americans had effectively lost most of their political rights in the South, and the Supreme Court upheld a lot of these Southern voter oppression laws. Now for the doctrine of separate but equal. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 granted blacks full and equal enjoyment of public facilities. This was a law passed by Congress. As more and more white Southerners rejected the idea of racial equality, Southern towns and companies began to enact Jim Crow laws mandating racial segregation in public facilities. Now, these Redeemer governments were big backers of this and supported it. In the 1883 civil rights cases, the Supreme Court ruled that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment only applies to state action and could not be used to regulate the behavior of private individuals or private organizations, making way for more enforcement of Jim Crow laws in the South. In 1896, the Supreme Court carried the logic of legal segregation a significant step further. In Plessy versus Ferguson, the court upheld segregation by approving the separate but equal doctrine. The Plessy versus Ferguson ruling allowed Jim Crow segregation laws to spread across the South. Within a few years, state and local statutes or laws required segregated schools, restaurants, and hotels. The Supreme Court ruled that separate was okay if separate was equal, but in reality, separate was not equal at all. Now fast forward to the 1954 Supreme Court ruling. Led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, Plessy versus Ferguson was unanimously overturned. Basing its decision in Brown versus Board of Education, which certainly was a monumental court ruling, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, the court concluded that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal had no place. This decision in the 1950s helped to galvanize the modern civil rights movement of the mid-1900s. So I hope this video helps you better understand the concept of the New South, its accomplishments, and its challenges. Thanks for listening and watching, and have a great rest of the day.